Picture yourself standing at the threshold of a stone cloister at dawn. The air is cold enough to sting your lungs, and the only sound is the soft crackle of a single candle fighting against the dark. A line of women in rough wool habits moves in perfect unison, their faces half hidden in shadow, not a whisper, not a cough, not even the sound of footfalls on the flagstones. Just silence, heavy, deliberate, almost otherworldly. You might think silence is peaceful, even comforting, but in a medieval convent, silence wasn't a cute mindfulness trend. It was a discipline, a weapon, a shield, and sometimes a burden that pressed harder than any physical labor. So here's the real question. How did these women build entire lives inside walls where speech itself was treated like something dangerous? Let's walk into their world, because the reality is far stranger, harsher, and more awe-inspiring than the romantic myths ever admit. The silence began before sunrise, long before most of the outside world even stirred. Medieval nuns woke in darkness, guided by the deep toll of the matins bell. Imagine being half asleep, freezing, clutching your cloak, and knowing the first words you might speak that day would be sung, not spoken, and only if the liturgy required it. Every sound mattered, because almost nothing was allowed. This wasn't accidental. Silence had been engineered deliberately into the structure of monastic life. The idea was simple. If you strip away distractions, conversation, gossip, unnecessary noise, then God becomes easier to hear. At least, that was the theory. But of course the reality was messier, because humans are endlessly messy. If you're imagining serene spiritual warriors, stop. These women were human, they got bored, they got angry, they had impulses, opinions, rivalries, and no acceptable outlet for any of it. When rules demanded silence, emotion had to find its own channels, and sometimes those channels were questionable. But let's step back, because the real story begins much earlier. Convents in medieval Europe weren't just religious enclaves. They were micro-societies, complete, self-contained worlds with their own hierarchies, politics, and daily rhythms. Most convents followed the rule of Saint Benedict, or a variation of it, which treated silence as an essential spiritual tool. The idea wasn't to punish speech, it was to create space for contemplation. But here's the contradiction no one likes to talk about. Medieval convents were also some of the busiest places around. Nuns worked, prayed, taught, farmed, healed, copied manuscripts, and managed finances. A convent wasn't some quiet retreat from society. It was often the beating intellectual and logistical heart of the community. So how do you run a full-scale institution when you're barely allowed to talk? One answer: gestures. Convents had elaborate codified sign languages long before modern sign language existed. Picture a nun raising her hand and curling two fingers to indicate the library, or tapping her cheek to refer to food, or making a circle over her heart to indicate a prayer request. Some gestures were practical, some symbolic, some bordering on theatrical, and these weren't random improvisations. They were mandatory. Some orders had over 100 signs, meticulously documented. Think about that. Silence became so embedded that entire manuals on how to communicate without speaking existed. But silence didn't rule every hour. Instead, it stretched through long segments of the day, meal times, communal work, recreation periods. Speech was permitted only in designated spaces, and even then, only a select few could use it freely. The abbess, for example, could speak more often. Other officers had permission depending on their duties. But the average nun? Her voice was rationed like a precious resource, which raises the obvious question: what does silence do to a person when it becomes the architecture of their life? To get a sense of that, imagine sitting at a long wooden table in the refectory, the dining hall. It's lunch. The smell of cabbage stew fills the air. Not exactly appetizing, but you haven't eaten since before sunrise. A single reader, standing at a pulpit, reads aloud from scripture or a saint's life, while everyone else eats in total silence. No chatting, no pass the salt, no laughter. The only sounds are the reader's steady voice and the clink of wooden spoons against clay bowls. You might think that sounds sterile, but the truth is more layered. Nuns weren't empty shells absorbing holiness. They were paying attention to each other, who ate quickly, who kept their eyes lowered, who seemed distracted. Silence had a way of amplifying everything. And in that silence they developed intense bonds, sometimes more intimate than anything spoken. You notice someone's breathing deepen when they're upset. You sense when someone's energy shifts. You learn the language of glances, gestures, shared tasks. It's a different kind of communication, one that modern people, drowning in noise and constant digital chatter, honestly struggle to even imagine. But silence wasn't always noble. Sometimes it was weaponized. Imagine a nun who breaks a rule. Maybe she oversleeps, maybe she speaks without permission, maybe she rolls her eyes during prayer. The penalty? Often enforced silence. Days without speaking to anyone. In some cases, other nuns were ordered not to communicate with her, even through gestures. Try not talking for 3 days. Then imagine it's not a mindful experiment. It's punishment. That's the darker side of this world. Silence became both a spiritual ideal and a disciplinary tool, and it created pressure cookers in which emotions simmered beneath perfectly calm faces. Of course, this raises another uncomfortable truth. Convents weren't uniformly strict. Some were extremely disciplined. Others operated with what we'll politely call flexibility. Historical records expose the whole spectrum. There were convents where silence was upheld with iron discipline, where the slightest whisper was treated as a serious breach. But there were also convents where nuns ignored the rules outright, talking freely when superiors weren't around, laughing, gossiping, even sneaking in musical instruments. One bishop complained that the nuns under his authority spoke more than parrots and gossiped more than fishwives. That's an actual line from the era, and it tells you everything. So when people today imagine medieval nuns as universally solemn figures gliding silently across cloisters, no, some were devout and disciplined, others were human beings behaving exactly like human beings always have, bending rules, pushing boundaries, and testing the patience of their superiors. But even in the rowdiest convents, silence still existed as a concept, something expected, something symbolic, something always looming over daily life. Why? Because silence wasn't just a rule, it was part of identity. It shaped how nuns saw themselves, how they felt God, and how they navigated their world. Let's zoom in on one moment, a moment that played out countless times. Imagine a novice, barely 16, brought into the convent by her family. Maybe she chose this life. Maybe she didn't. Either way, she kneels during her first night, surrounded by women she doesn't know, in a building she's never slept in. The silence feels dense, like stepping underwater, and she realizes this isn't a temporary stillness, this is her new reality. She's told to guard her tongue, to listen more than she speaks, to find God in the quiet. But what if the quiet terrifies her? What if her thoughts get louder than any voice? Silence can be healing, it can also be suffocating. And many novices struggled with that internal noise far more than the external restrictions. Yet over time, most adapted. Humans always adapt. The silence that once felt overwhelming became a kind of rhythm, a space, a way of thinking. Some nuns reported experiencing profound clarity during silent stretches, a sharpness of mind modern people rarely feel because our environments are relentless assault zones of noise, notifications, and conversations. Ironically, a medieval nun might have found modern life unbearable, the constant chatter, music, cars, shouting. All of it would feel chaotic, even violent. For them, silence wasn't emptiness, it was normality. And yes, some nuns absolutely pushed the boundaries. Silence didn't erase creativity, it sometimes fueled it. Nuns wrote poetry, illuminated manuscripts, composed music, managed estates, practiced medicine, and taught children. Their silence didn't mean isolation from the world. It meant engaging with it differently, filtering reality through discipline and introspection. But there's another side too, silence as a source of power. Consider this. Most medieval women had almost no authority outside the home, yet inside a convent, a woman, the abbess, could command land, money, political influence, and spiritual authority. Her voice, used sparingly, carried weight. Silence made it sharper, more deliberate. When an abbess spoke, people listened. In that context, silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy, like a sharpened blade. So how did they actually endure it day after day, year after year? They didn't just endure, they built entire emotional ecosystems inside the quiet. Nuns wrote letters, sometimes hundreds, filled with passion, devotion, frustration, longing, and humor. They broke silence through song, chanting the liturgy together, voices rising and falling in waves that shattered the stillness in the most controlled way possible. Music became the allowable release valve, a socially sanctioned moment of expression when words, finally, could take flight. And when silence became too heavy, they leaned on each other. They formed friendships, alliances, rivalries, whispered or not. They shared subtle glances, soft smiles, quiet acts of kindness. The absence of words didn't stop human connection. It intensified it, because when you strip away constant talk, the meaning behind every tiny action becomes sharper. But there's a final contradiction we need to confront. Medieval nuns believed silence brought them closer to God. Modern psychologists would say silence brings you closer to yourself, and not always in a comfortable way. Silence forces you to confront your thoughts. And let's be honest, most people today can't go 10 minutes without reaching for a distraction, because being alone with their mind is unnerving. Medieval nuns didn't get that choice. They faced their inner lives head-on. Some found peace. Some broke under the pressure. Some flourished intellectually. Some rebelled. Silence shaped each of them differently, sometimes elevating them, sometimes exposing them. And that's the real mystery of this world. Silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a constantly shifting landscape that each nun navigated in her own way. So what does all of this show us? That silence can be a discipline, a burden, a punishment, a refuge and a weapon, all at once. That human beings can adapt to almost anything, even a life where their own voice becomes a stranger. And that sometimes the most intense forms of communication aren't spoken at all. It makes you wonder, could you survive a life where silence isn't a choice, but a requirement? Would it sharpen your mind or unravel it? Let me know in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you want more hidden historical stories like this, make sure to subscribe. We've barely scratched the surface of what the past has to teach us, and some of its secrets are quieter than you'd ever expect.